Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign, Urbana. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, February 13th. Happy Mardi Gras. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingeni est, odisse cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, an international criminal operation surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we try to do here at Aware on the Air is talk about U.S. war making. We begin with a report from our Aware colleague Karen Aram on a meeting held Saturday at the Independent Media Center here in Urbana about a group called Women Against War. The panel discussion took place under fairly tightly controlled circumstances, and Karen writes about it as follows. The panel on Women Against War, the State Representative Carol Ammons presented Saturday at the IMC in Urbana, was well done. I especially applaud Robert Naiman for his presentation on war and the buildup of our nuclear arsenal. There appeared to be 40 to 50 attendees, with about 8 being interns. Rather than harp on that which was left out, I prefer focusing on that which was captured, for the many attendees with little knowledge of what is actually taking place, and ensuring who is to be feared, and that it is us. That was the main point, and I'm pleased that it was accomplished by Naiman. The Korean professor, who had to speak by way of Skype, was okay, though clearly lacking the depth that those of us focused on war in Korea would have preferred. She also glossed over the U.S. reneging on the agreement in the 90s that we would provide water reactors to North Korea, given we destroyed their dams with our bombs in the Korean War, if they halted their nuclear weapons buildup, by implying both sides were responsible due to distrust. The young woman speaking on nuclear power was asked to explain what it is, and though she made a point that it is safe, unless used as a weapon, she didn't appear to be pushing an agenda. We will see when I attend Thursday's upcoming meeting of WAND, which one young woman is starting a chapter. At this point, it appears that the goal is women becoming active against war. The question and answer session was limited to the audience turning in cards with questions. One of my solutions was addressed first. After that question was asked by Carol. This is Karen Aram, of course, talking about her contribution. I suggested, and it was addressed by Bob Naiman, a freeze on freeze as recommended by China. My other solutions, 2 of which were already addressed, the use of diplomacy with a peace treaty, removing U.S. troops from the DMZ, that's not quite what she means, stop the U.S. military exercises with South Korea, remove our nuclear-armed ships in the South China Sea. That which was not addressed was the sanctions. Sanctions described as a slow death versus a quick death nuclear war. THAAD, the missile system, which is aimed at both China and Russia, and the fact that the sanctions which are crippling are aimed also at North Korea trade partners. Those missiles are installed by South Korea at American insistence. That's Karen Aram's account of the Women Against War panel last Saturday at the Independent Media Center here in Urbana. I had a rather different take on it. The panel was designed to neutralize objections to Democratic Party war-making, both locally and nationally, as that war-making has been on display in the Obama administration. Trump attacked that Obama-Clinton warmongering during the campaign. That was part of what made him president. But in office, Trump has adopted it at the insistence of the political establishment. That's what Russiagate is all about, to force the new administration to take on the war provocations and the war actions of the Obama administration. The Obama administration is the first administration in American history to have been at war throughout 2 presidential terms. Obama left 8 wars to the incoming Trump administration, and the genius of the Obama administration was to mask it, to keep Americans from realizing what the situation was. Representative Ammons, in the Saturday discussion, presented the panel as being about Trump's threat of war against North Korea. There was no mention of that day's peace overtures, that very day's peace overtures from North Korea during the Olympics, or, by the way, of the Vice President's boorish response to this attempt by North Korea to discuss these matters in the context of the Olympic Games. Devoted to peace, of course, as Olympic Games are supposed to be. Bob Naiman of Just Foreign Policy gave a regime-friendly account of recent American nuclear doctrine and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, without mentioning one nuclear state that hasn't signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that is Israel. He also didn't mention that North Korea has offered the double freeze proposed by China and Russia, the freeze of the nuclear development, development of nuclear weapons in the North, to be paralleled by a freeze of American and South Korea war games and provocations in the South. This is the proposal presented frequently and recently by Russia and China and the United Nations. The U.S. has turned it down. He also didn't mention that this proposal, the double freeze, was offered to both the Obama and Trump administrations by North Korea and was rejected both times by the American administrations. U.S. policy, it's clear, is to harass the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the real name of the North Korean government. U.S. policy is to harass North Korea, which was the victim of frightful U.S. destruction in the 1950s, unknown to most Americans, as part of the containment of China, the long-term goal of American foreign policy. The high point of the panel's advice, you had to be there to believe this, came from the self-described nuclear engineer on the panel, who opined that if you're in the vicinity of a nuclear explosion, the best thing to do was to run west. That's because the prevailing winds are from the west. You can't, as is said, make this stuff up. No questions were taken from the sparse assembled throng, except in written form, and since only one of them was answered, the question written by our colleague Karen Aram, they didn't get to my question. My question was, Carol, you have supported, Representative Ammons, you have supported Israeli apartheid in the Illinois legislature, and Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons. Would you support the U.S. taking them away, as it did with the nuclear weapons of Iraq and Iran? the question lay there unanswered. The fraudulent panel contained practically no mention of the anti-war demands of AWARE and other peace groups around the world, such as one, ending the 7 aggressive wars inherited from the Obama administration, stopping the drone assassinations, the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, and ending the war provocations against Russia and China from Eastern Europe to the South China Sea. And 2, bringing home the 300,000 U.S. troops in 1,000 foreign bases, including the 70,000 U.S. Special Forces in 3/4 of the country of the world, and the profitable U.S. arms transfers to known human rights abusers, notably Saudi Arabia and Israel. That would be an anti-war program, and that is urged by people around the world, but that, of course, was not considered in Saturday's debate. You're watching AWARE on the Air. We're talking about the local discussions of war, particularly war against Korea. And it's worthwhile to break through the miasma of propaganda around the American dispute with the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. Brainwashed Americans believe that Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, is responsible for the confrontation between Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, and Washington. But nothing could be further from the truth. The real problem is not Kim's nuclear weapons, but Washington's 65-year-long military occupation that continues to reinforce a political solution that was arbitrarily imposed on a sovereign nation in order to split the country in two, install a puppet regime in the South, establish a permanent military presence to defend U.S. commercial interests, and maintain control of the strategically located territory that is a critical part of Washington's plan to encircle Russia and China in order to remain the dominant global power throughout the century.
Hey guys.
Simply put, Washington is 100% responsible for the current confrontation, just as it has been responsible for every flare-up of the last 7 decades. Even so, fighting back against the relentless outpouring of U.S.-backed state propaganda is no easy task. So allow me to defend the position of the DPRK with just one brief analogy will help to put things into perspective. Imagine if the Korean Army decided to deploy tens of thousands of combat troops to fight on the side of the Confederacy during the Civil War. The American Civil War, I mean. And let's say that these forces were so successful that they were able to kill 3 million Americans while reducing every business and factory, every home and hospital, every church and university in the South to smoldering rubble. I've got my parallels getting out of hand here. The notion is try to imagine what would happen if America's Civil War had been invaded by Koreans, by a Korean army that fought on the side of the South, as the Korean Civil War was invaded by an American army. Let's say that while these forces were so successful, they were able to kill 3 million Americans while reducing every business and factory, every home and hospital, every church and university to smoldering rubble. As a result of Korean meddling in our imagined American Civil War, the North was unable to win the war, but was forced to settle for an armistice that permanently split the U.S. into North and South, allowing Korea to install its stooges in the capital of Richmond, while it established military bases in every southern state from Virginia to Louisiana. Let's say this arrangement worked for over 6 decades, from the mid-19th into the 20th century, due mainly to the efforts of Korean propagandists who derided any attempt at reconciliation, dialogue, or reunification. Let's say activists and politicians in the North pushed for a sunshine policy that would foster communication and better relations between the two sides, North and South, but their efforts were constantly sabotaged by self-serving imperial overlords, in this case from China, from Korea, who saw any move towards dialogue as a threat to their continued presence in the South. So they engaged in the same illicit practices the U.S. engages in today. That is, sowing dissension, discord, and division between the two sides, always provoking more trouble, more disharmony, more acrimony. Always and everywhere pushing forward the imperial agenda by turning the bulk of the world's population into Shia and Sunni at each other's throats. Isn't that the grand plan? Divide and conquer, pit one brother against the other, keep all of us at each other's throats, in order to justify the ongoing occupation, in order to justify the ongoing meddling, in order to justify the ongoing economic exploitation that the U.S. has encouraged since the Second World War. Of course it is. The United States has never lifted its sanctions on North Korea, never treated their leaders with anything except contempt and brutality, and never made any sincere attempt to end the hostilities. Washington will not even sit down with a delegation from the DPRK, North Korea, to air their differences or discuss a path forward. The only point where the United States will sit down was when the American vice president should show some courtesy to the political delegations at the Olympics, the only place the U.S. shouldn't sit down, and Vice President Pence decided indeed to sit down there, rudely, boorishly. Why? Is it because the DPRK is a communist state? Is that it? Heck no. The U.S. has open trade relations with China and Vietnam, both of whom share a similar Marxist ideology. Even more shocking, the U.S. now employs an openly utopian Marxist militia, the Kurdish YPG. If you've been following the situation in Syria, you'll know that the YPG that the U.S. is sponsoring in northern Syria, based on anarchist communist principles, and in contrast with a good number of the other Kurdish communities in Syria, and that's the one the U.S. is backing. The U.S. is backing these leftist Kurds and as a proxy army in the U.S. fight to topple the government in Damascus, the Assad government. Think about that for a minute. Washington shock troops in Syria are basically a bunch of commies, real communists, people who think that that's the tradition upon which you build a society. I don't say that to criticize the Kurds, but to illustrate the contemptible lack of principle and utter hypocrisy of everything Washington says or does. Washington doesn't care what one's personal philosophy is. Washington cares about power. And anything that helps to enhance Washington's grip on global power is the supreme good. The United States refuses to sign a treaty with the North, ending the war, refuses to sit down with delegates from the North, and refuses to provide any security assurances that they won't attack the North at any time for any reason. This is Washington's policy towards North Korea, and yet we continue to read almost daily in the New York Times and Washington Post and the other trusted elite media that the North is, quote, threatening the U.S., close quote, that the North is impulsive and violent, and that the North must be punished for its defiance. It's baloney. The North is not responsible for the crisis in the peninsula. The U.S. is responsible, 100% responsible. Fearing that peace might break out with the two Koreas talking to each other, Washington instructed South Korea President Moon Jae-in to keep the message about anything but peace. It is not just Trump. A former top official for the Obama administration warned Moon, President of South Korea, that South Korea was not going to get anywhere with the North Koreans unless they have the U.S. behind them. The official wanted to say, if South Koreans are viewed as running off the leash, it will exacerbate tensions within the alliance. This is borne out even in terms of the seating arrangement in the Olympics. South Korea, the U.S. fears, could go off the leash. In fact, the U.S. is insisting that South Korea stay on the leash, even though it indicates, the new South Korean government indicates that it wants to see if it can establish some decent relations with the other half of the country. That flippant quote deserves some careful consideration, off the leash, mainly because it's not just a one-off, but rather summarizes the fundamental master-slave relationship between leaders in the South and their colonial boss men in Washington. And as I say, interesting indications that the new president of South Korea is, in fact, changing that. It's Washington that's calling the shots in the South, still for the moment, Washington that controls the Korean military, and Washington that sets the policy. This is essentially how the system works. Conversely, countries that defend their own sovereignty, like Russia, Iran, North Korea, or Venezuela, remain outside the U.S.-run system, making them Washington's de facto enemies to be demonized and threatened. But it's not ideology that Washington cares about, it's independence, i.e., will these countries do what they're told by Washington? U.S. military occupation following World War II was more hostile and brutal than the Japanese colonial government in Korea. In fact, from 1945 to 1948, the U.S. military continued to employ Japanese colonialists, and Japanese law remained in effect. The prostitution of Korean women was official government policy for the purpose of now entertaining U.S. soldiers. We hear much about the problems, about the claims of the comfort women, as they were called, today in Korea, who were forced to be prostitutes for the Japanese army. It's not mentioned that the system was maintained by the U.S. for its own army when the U.S. took over Korea at the end of the Second World War. Meanwhile, in North Korea, the Soviet Civil Authority supported the peasant organizations and workers' councils. In March 1946, land reform was instituted, in which land owned by Japanese colonizers and the Korean collaborators was divided and handed over to poor farmers. The rule of the land-owning class was broken in Korea and North Korea, and landlords were allowed to keep only the same amount of land as their former tenants. But Soviet forces left the peninsula in 1948. U.S. occupation troops remain in South Korea to this day. Washington continues to falsely claim that North Korea is to blame for the continued division of Korea. However, U.S. imperialism and the 32,000 U.S. troops that are stationed in South Korea to enforce the border between North and South remain the predominant obstacle to reunification of the Korean peninsula. U.S. imperialism from the beginning of Japanese colonization to today has never had the interests of the Korean people in mind. For years, the U.S. kept the same savage colonial system in place in order to partition the country and to prevent the Korean people from deciding their own future. That basic system is still in place today, thanks largely to Washington's oppressive military presence. The 64-year-old South Korea-U.S. Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, that has allowed U.S. forces to control the South Korean Army and to continue joint military operations. SOFA, the Status of Forces Agreement with South Korea, is the symbol of the U.S. military occupation of South Korea and has reduced South Korea into an advanced base for nuclear war. There are, of course, peaceful remedies to the current standoff, the most reasonable of which is the Moon-Putin plan, named after South Korean President Moon Jae-in and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Here's a brief summary of the plan. The Moon-Putin plan is a plan to bring South and North Korea together through physical infrastructure and trade mechanisms involving the neighboring countries of Russia and China. You see why the U.S. is not too happy with it. Bridges of cooperation linking South Korea to Russia via North Korea, gas, railroads, ports, electricity, a northern sea route, shipbuilding, jobs, agriculture, and fisheries. Siberian oil and gas pipelines would be extended to Korea, both north and south, as well as to Japan. Both Koreas would be linked up with the vast rail networks of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, including high-speed rail and the Eurasian Economic Union, which includes the Trans-Siberian Railway. You see what the U.S. is opposed to and what the concerns about Korea really are. The containment of Russia and China and the prevention of the economic integration of Eurasia, which has been the basis of American policy for more than a century, now takes the form of the harassment of North Korea. North Korea would accept the security guarantee of all five of these countries, refrain from any further nuclear or missile testing, shelve or freeze its existing programs, and gain its longed-for normalization in the form of incorporation in regional groupings, the lifting of sanctions, and normalized relations with its neighbor states without surrender. This is the Moon Putin plan, and the fact that the president of South Korea is off the reservation from the American point of view by suggesting that this would be a good idea is one of the reasons that the U.S. is busily heightening tensions in Korea. The plan sounds reasonable, doesn't it? What better way to reduce the chance of another bloody war than economic integration? Which is why the Trump administration not only opposes the idea, but it's also why the entire Western media have made sure that no one even hears about it. Had you heard about it? Coverage of the Moon Putin plan has been completely blacked out in our vaunted free media. As it happens, policy options that don't jibe with Washington's chronic warmongering never see the light of day. This problem is presented anew to Washington in the Olympics. It seems the two Koreas are actually moving ahead on their own. No thanks, of course, to the U.S. The U.S. opposes any plan that involves open dialogue, economic integration, reunification, or a peaceful resolution of the crisis. What Washington wants is to preserve the status quo. They want a Korea that is divided, occupied, powerless, and languishing in a permanent state of colonial dependency. And the target is China. The harassment of Korea is involved with the overall American policy of containing China and hobbling the move towards economic integration of Eurasia in general, which is seen as a threat to American worldwide economic control. This isn't new. This was the American policy as far back as the open door policy before the First World War. Koreans suffer from the American imposition of that policy until today. You are watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the abject nonsense that we're hearing in this country about the Korean situation. Aware, the local anti-war organization that sponsors this program, meets regularly every Sunday at the Coffee Connection in Urbana. Our meetings are Sunday night, 5 p.m., and they're open to anyone interested in working on anti-war issues in the current situation. At the Aware meeting last Sunday night, I said something discourteous about Paul Street. Paul Street is a longtime friend of Aware. We have FOA medals made up, and was one of the first to descry the dissimulations of candidate Barack Obama long ago, pulled together in his book, Barack Obama and the Future of American Politics, published in 2008. That was a summary of earlier articles in which Paul Street successfully decoded Barack Obama's machinations and gave an account of what the Obama administration would be like, or what, if indeed candidate Obama became President Obama. As you may know, he did. But it seems to me now, today, this prescient writer, Paul Street, is suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. He's been writing a number of articles recently, some of them published on the website of our friend Jeffrey Sinclair, Counterpunch. And Street's stuff is well-informed, as he's been for years, but there's an edge of madness in it, it seems to me, that apparently is constructed by the present occupant of the White House. Someone at this meeting on Sunday, I'll protect their anonymity, remarked on Paul Street's frenzied search for ever more disobliging epithets for the president. That's one of the characteristics you may have noticed of Russiagate. You have to say things about hair and bluster and so forth and so on, rather than about the actual policies presented during the campaign by President Trump and the rather different policies he's followed in office. But Paul Street is back on form in his latest article, A Critique of the Second Most Dangerous Myth in U.S. Politics, the myth of Kennedy liberalism. The first most dangerous myth is, of course, the congeries of lies about World War II. See now the excellent article by Nicholson Baker, The Dangerous Myth of the Good War. He's talking about the uses of the image of the Second World War in contemporary American politics, and I'll put that important article on the Facebook page for Aware. In fact, I think it's already there. Paul Street offers us an article entitled Joe Kennedy III, Another False Progressive Idol Like John F. Kennedy, who was president in the 1960s. Street begins, my first political memory is the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK. I was 5 years old, home from kindergarten on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. I was in the living room in a small apartment in the liberal, racially integrated neighborhood of Hyde Park on the south side of Chicago. The television was on because my mother had been watching soap operas on CBS. After Walter Cronkite announced that Kennedy had been proclaimed dead, I relayed the news to my mother, who was ironing sheets in an adjacent hallway. She burst into tears. My recollections of Kennedy's death is forever linked to an image of my mother quietly sobbing in a haze of white steam. At my age, I of course had no idea why anyone would weep over Jack Kennedy's death. Later it came into focus. My parents were post-war liberal Democrats. Kennedy was something of a hero in my household. My father was a young jazz piano-playing academic, a sociologist encouraged by Kennedy's purported cultivation of intellectuals in the arts, a break from the official suspicion in which thinkers and artists had been held during the bleak McCarthy years of the 1950s. Kennedy was the nation's first Catholic president, no small matter for my half-Irish Catholic mother. He was identified to some degree with black civil rights, a cause my parents supported. Kennedy had Ivy League credentials, something that appealed to the professional class ideology my parents had absorbed from their middle-class upbringings and higher education. To complete this mythic picture, the dashing young president and his glamorous wife had telegenic, movie star charisma and charm and small children of their own. That's why my mother broke into tears the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. Sadly, however, my young parents and a generation of smart young liberal Democrats granted JFK far more love and respect than he deserved. 5.5 decades later, so do liberal Democrats who pine for a new Jack Kennedy in the White House. But JFK spent the lion's share of his presidency on the wrong side of each of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., another assassinated 1960s icon with whom Kennedy is often absurdly conflated, called the triple evils that are interrelated: racism, economic injustice, and militarism. Kennedy is a false progressive idol of the highest order, something you won't learn about on MSNBC. I have to be careful. A friend of mine always refers to that as an MSDNC, and he's got me doing it too. On that mainstream media sluice, Democratic Party commentator Chris Matthews lives in a seemingly permanent state of Kennedy family worship. Let's start with the second of King's triple evils, class rule. The role played by 20th century presidents has been characteristically conservative. Liberal as well as conservative presidents have bent their strongest efforts not to alter, but to preserve America's dominant institutions. Whatever their professed sympathies, their actions have served not to redistribute wealth and power, but to perpetuate existing inequalities, serving as central figures in the maintenance of established hierarchical socioeconomic arrangements. This is from a classic text on American politics from more than 40 years ago. And in the subsequent 40 years, that inequality has not only increased rapidly, it's accelerated in its increase. So we have a situation far different from the one that was described by this particular political scientist 42 years ago. That was Bruce Murroff. As Murroff demonstrated in his forgotten 1976 classic, Pragmatic Illusions, The Presidential Politics of John F. Kennedy, JFK was no exception to this rule of maintenance of the socioeconomic inequality. More than a decade before neoliberal Democrats emerged to explicitly steer the Democratic Party further to the corporate right, JFK's superficially declared sympathies for the poor and working class took a back seat in his White House to the real determinants of policy, political calculation, and economic doctrine. As Murroff explained, political cunning led Kennedy to appease the corporate giants and their allies in government. Economic doctrine told him that the key to the expansion and health of the economy was the health and expansion of those same corporate giants. The architects of Kennedy's new economics liked to portray it as the technically sophisticated and politically neutral management of a modern industrial economy. It is more accurately portrayed as a pragmatic liberalism in the service of corporate capitalism. The regressive nature of JFK's new economics was cloaked by his recurrent, much-publicized spats with certain members of the business community, the executives of U.S. Steel above all, his repeated statements of concern for labor and the poor, and his claim to advance a purely technical and pragmatic economic agenda that elevated practical management and administrative expertise above the grand warfare of ideologies. JFK inhabited the same centrist, cautious, cunning, and pragmatic place on the first of King's triple evils, racism. Kennedy might have found it politically useful to intervene on King's behalf during the latter's jailing in the election year of 1960, and later to wrap himself in the aura of racial progress and equality by offering some partial and belated federal protections to the civil rights movement, CRM, as it was referred to. But the Kennedy administration worked hard to divide and dilute the CRM, seeking to channel it to staid and narrow legal and electoral grooves. The JFK White House gave some elementary shelter to activists and Southern blacks only when the president and his practically co-presidential brother and Attorney General Bobby Kennedy calculated that rabid white Southern reaction was undermining their ability to sell the United States as a model of enlightened democracy in the Cold War contests of the Soviet Union for the allegiances of the non-white Third World. Subsequent elitist Mississippi burning revisionism, that's a movie, the time that misrepresented and praised the federal role and the federal government's role in the civil rights movement. Subsequent elitist Mississippi burning revisionism notwithstanding, the Kennedy administration was no great friend of the struggle for black equality. Its response to the black freedom movement was dominated by the tension between two competing political calculations. One, the threat of politically alienating white Americans, above all traditionally Democratic and white Southerners. And two, the risk of losing third world hearts and minds in the supposed U.S. struggle to advance freedom and democracy. The contradiction stood out around the world. Kennedy and his brother bent over backwards to accommodate Southern racists, leaving them feeling free to kill and maim civil rights activists in the Deep South. When the Federal Civil Rights Commission announced that it would investigate racist violence in Mississippi, the younger Kennedy denounced the commission as being like the House Un-American Activities Committee investigating communists. When NAACP leader Medgar Evers was shot down in his own driveway, Bobby Kennedy said that it was not the federal government's job to protect black activists. It was up to the state of Mississippi. The real experience and struggles of black Americans were not an especially relevant concern to the Kennedys. When Southern racist authorities managed to defeat the civil rights movement without politically problematic and embarrassing violence, as in Albany, Georgia in 1962, the Kennedy administration was happy to withhold protection from King and his fellow activists. When racist police commissioner Bull Connor attacked black protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, with high-pressure water hoses, dogs, and batons in May 1963, JFK complained that the demonstrators were making the U.S. look bad in the world, and Bobby Kennedy claimed that 90% of the protesters had no idea why they were in the streets. Along the way, Kennedy appointed at least 5 segregationists to the federal judiciary, turning to the racist Mississippi Senator James Eastland for advice on appointments. The Kennedy brothers were inordinately obsessed with alleged communist connections to King and the civil rights movement. They approved racist FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's regular and relentless police state surveillance, smearing, and infiltration of the civil rights movement. This ugly Kennedy history would be less surprising to liberal progressive, perhaps, if they would carefully read JFK's best-selling, Pulitzer Prize-winning 1957 book, Profiles in Courage. Somebody else wrote it for him. There, Kennedy foretold his coming weak civil rights record, purveying Southern white historical mythology by referring to the Reconstruction era after the Civil War as a, quote, black nightmare nourished by federal bayonets, close quote. The black there does not refer to race, but rather to the oppression visited upon the post-war South by the federal government in this interpretation. Turning to King's third evil, JFK's foreign policy record was militantly imperial and militarist, contrary to the subsequent liberal and left hagiographers' weird determination to reinvent him as a man of the left. As Noam Chomsky noted in his 1993 study, Rethinking Camelot, JFK, the Vietnam War, and U.S. Political Culture, quote, one of the most significant legacies left by the Kennedy administration was his 1962 decision to shift the mission of the Latin American military from hemispheric defense to internal security, leading, in the words of Kennedy's top Latin American counterinsurgency planner, Charles Makeling, to, quote, direct U.S. complicity in the methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads. The shift to deadly internal repression in Latin America was a natural corollary to Kennedy's export-promoting Alliance for Progress development program, which benefited Latin American elites while drastically increasing Latin American unemployment. When Kennedy was assassinated, the CIA and JFK's advisors were working with his approval to overthrow a democratically elected government and install a fascist military dictatorship in Brazil. The plan was carried out successfully months later. Brazil, Chomsky observed 11 years ago, had a moderately populist democratic government in the early 1960s. The Kennedy administration organized a military coup that imposed a neo-Nazi national security state that was the first of the plague that then spread throughout the continent to Chile, Argentina, Central America, and then became one big massacre. In Cuba, where Washington's Third World fascist allies had been overthrown and forced to flee after Fidel Castro and Che Guevara led a popular socialist revolution in 1959, the Kennedy administration made repeated attempts to assassinate the nation's leaders and launched an ongoing campaign of terror and sabotage. After the U.S.-run Bay of Pigs invasion operation that Kennedy inherited from Dwight Eisenhower failed spectacularly in its efforts to spark a rebellion against Castro in April 1961, Kennedy asked his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to lead the top-level interagency group that oversaw Operation Mongoose, a program of paramilitary operations, economic warfare, and sabotage Kennedy launched in late 1961 to, quote, visit the terrors of the earth on Fidel Castro and, more prosaically, to topple him. This explicit terror campaign included the murder of 400 Cuban factory workers in early November 1962, less than 2 weeks after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy understood the thoroughly conditional nature of democracy as a U.S. foreign policy objective when he remarked that while the U.S. would prefer democratic regimes abroad, it will choose a pro-American dictator like Trujillo over an anti-American dictator like Castro if those were the only choices. It's necessary only to add, Chomsky observed in 1991, that Kennedy's concept of a Castro was very broad, including anyone who challenged U.S. power and global capitalism. Then there's Vietnam. Kennedy raised the level of U.S. attack on Indochina from international terrorism to outright aggression in 1961 and 62, justifying the use of U.S. air power to napalm social revolutionaries, defoliate Vietnamese countrysides, and slaughter innocent peasants with the false claims that, quote, we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless Soviet Marxist conspiracy, close quote. That was Kennedy's suggestion of why we had to kill Vietnamese in great numbers, and that the failure to stop communism in Vietnam would open the gates to Soviet world domination. Actually, I was old enough at least to hear this nonsense, and that was what the Kennedy administration said. After the epic failure of the CIA's Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba and the erection of the Berlin Wall in East Germany, Kennedy told the New York Times' James Reston in 1961 that, quote, now we have a problem in making our anti-communist Cold War power credible, and Vietnam is the place, close quote. Vietnam was always a geopolitical problem for the Kennedy administration that they were going to solve by killing people. Would Kennedy, as some of his liberal and left fans, like Oliver Stone and James K. Galbraith, son of JFK's assistant, John Kenneth Galbraith, whom I knew slightly, claim, would Kennedy have withdrawn U.S. forces from Vietnam had he not been assassinated in late November of 1963? Oliver Stone even made a blockbuster movie to claim that the supposed peace advocate JFK was murdered by the CIA to permit U.S. escalation in Vietnam under the leadership of Lyndon Johnson, portrayed as an agent of the defense industry and right-wing military officers. This has been a topic of dispute between and among left and liberal historians and researchers, including Rick Perlstein, Galbraith, Stone, and Chomsky. They dispute the significance and meaning of JFK's apparent October 1963 decision and plan to remove U.S. troops from Vietnam by the end of 1965. The winners in the debate are Perlstein and Chomsky, who correctly observed that Kennedy's withdrawal plan was conditional on full U.S. victory over the Vietnamese Revolution and independence movement. It would not have been carried out given harsh realities on the ground. As Perlstein noted 5 years ago, whether John F. Kennedy's formal decision would be carried through in the interim between October 63 and January 66 was contingent on what happened in the future. One day this summer I issued a formal decision to go to the beach. Then it rained, and so I did not go to the beach. And as anyone who knows anything about the Vietnam War knows, the people funneling intelligence to the president were alarmingly adept in claiming the sun was shining, when actually it was pouring down rain, i.e. that the U.S. was winning the war in Vietnam, or so Kennedy was told. In fact, when it came to America's military prospects there, it was winter in Seattle just about all the time. That metaphor may be getting out of hand, but I think you see the point. JFK's late-in-life public statements were consistent with Chomsky and Perlstein's sense that the doomed young president had no intention of pulling back from his mass murderous assault in Vietnam until U.S. victory was attained. In Fort Worth, just hours before his assassination, for example, Kennedy said that, quote, without the United States, South Vietnam would collapse overnight, close quote. In a speech he would have delivered in Dallas, Kennedy was going to say that the U.S. and its role as watchman on the walls of world freedom had to carry out duties that were, quote, painful, risky, and costly, as is true in Southeast Asia today. But we dare not weary of the task, close quote. In repeated statements in the summer and fall, or early fall of 1963, Kennedy left no doubt that for him, withdrawal without victory was unthinkable. But if Kennedy had survived and removed U.S. forces from Vietnam, this would have meant only that JFK had decided that U.S.-trained and U.S.-equipped the Vietnamese troops and the U.S.-funded regime of South Vietnam were capable of defeating the Vietnamese Revolution without the further engagement of U.S. troops, on the model, say, of the mass murderous U.S.-backed Suharto government in Indonesia. The vast massacre that the CIA produced in Indonesia in 1965 was given at the time as the way the Vietnam War should have been fought. That is, we shouldn't hold back from killing those people identified as enemies, as the Suharto regime did in Indonesia. The most nauseating claim by members of the liberal Jack Kennedy cult holds that JFK heroically saved humanity from nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. The truth is precisely the opposite. In effect, the British journalist Joseph Richardson noted 5 years ago in an article properly titled JFK's Lunatic Priorities During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy's government was prepared to risk a nuclear conflagration to safeguard U.S. prestige. Kennedy's Secretary of State Dean Rusk jubilantly exclaimed after the first Soviet ships opted not to run the American blockade that, quote, we're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked, close quote. Had the Soviets not blinked, it is likely Rusk would not have been around to give his reaction. But for Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, except for Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's determination to let humanity survive, and the heroic intervention of a Soviet submarine commander named Vasily Arkhipov beneath the Western Atlantic in the early evening of October 27, 1962, it seems likely that Kennedy's reckless naval blockade and nuclear machismo would have set off World War III. The story of Arkhipov and how close we had actually came to a nuclear exchange over Cuba in 1962 is worth telling. It wasn't told until a few years ago. I'll place an account of that on the Aware Facebook page along with this article and others. At the same time, Kennedy set the stage for the strange Lovian 1 minute to midnight moment by dramatically escalating the international arms race and with his incursions into Cuba, military incursions, attacks on Cuba, which provoked Castro into seeking a Soviet nuclear shield against U.S. invasion. The U.S. was indeed planning to invade Cuba. Despite all this and more, JFK still maintains a strange reputation as an agent of peace and social justice among certain persistently starstruck people of the left. I get emails from readers who see the assassination of JFK in the same light as they see the murder of Dr. King, as if both martyrs were great people's leaders fighting heroically for racial equality, social justice, and peace. They speak of Kennedy's assassination as his martyrdom for peace. This is all nonsense. Just 3 days ago, an anti-war peace environmentalist wrote me via social media to protest the erasure of what she called the real legacy of JFK, which was that he may have saved the world from nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he wanted peace, close quote. She insists that I read Catholic worker James Douglas's 2008 book, JFK and the Unspeakable, which purports to show that Kennedy was killed by the CIA and its military-industrial allies because he had decided to switch from being a man of empire to being a man of peace. I know Jim Douglas from years ago. He is a fine man, and his book is the best statement of this absolutely impossible thesis, the best defense of Kennedy and the notion that he was murdered because he planned to withdraw from Vietnam. It's not true, but if you want that argument, go to Jim Douglas's book. As Louis Proyak, another friend of this ground, noted in a sharp 2005 reflection on JFK's undeserved progressive standing, quote, despite its obvious futility, the search for enlightened bourgeois leadership seems never-ending, close quote. The real history that makes the equation of Jack Kennedy and Dr. King preposterous, and indeed Orwellian, is worth keeping in mind in light of the Democratic Party's recent ham-fisted attempt to rewrap itself in the flag of the Kennedy mystique by having Bobby Kennedy's 37-year-old grandson, and JFK's grandnephew, Congressman Joseph Kennedy III, Democrat of Massachusetts, give the neoliberal Democrats' televised response to Donald Trump's first State of the Union address. As the political site Politico explained before the address, tapping Joe Kennedy III is notable because he represents a younger wave of Democrats in a party that is sometimes criticized for its cadre of older leaders and potential 2020 presidential candidates, all in their 70s, people in their 70s. It was about more than age alone. The Democratic Party's neoliberal corporate and imperial elite is concerned about the attraction that the anti-plutocratic and social democratish Scandinavia-praising progressivism of Bernie Sanders has understandably had for younger Democratic voters. Could the young Kennedy be a new outwardly progressive-seeming, but in fact corporate and Wall Street-friendly knight in shining dynastic armor? Is his job to keep excessively left-leaning young voters on board with the dismal, dollar-drenched, inauthentic opposition party of wealth and power-serving Wall Street, the Democrats, and defense industry captive Democrats like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Charles Schumer, and Nancy, we're capitalists and that's just the way it is, Pelosi? The young and obscenely wealthy young congressman, Joe Kennedy III has a net worth of more than $43 million, is a single-payer opponent whose top donors include the global investment firm Crescent Capital, Bank of America, Raytheon, and Bain Capital. Remember them? Glenn Greenwald tweeted with dark irony about the Joe Kennedy speaking assignment. Quote, good to see Democrats trying something new. It's been 13 whole months since they ran a very rich candidate with deep Wall Street and corporate ties from a famous political family. Maybe it'll work this time, close quote. Thankfully, perhaps, the only thing that shined in Congressman Kennedy's badly delivered high school-level speech, a transparent and botched attempt to mimic Barack Obama's keynote address at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, was the glaring lip balm that gleamed at the corner of his mouth, earning him designation as the victim and perpetrator of chapstick acquittic. If you're too young to understand that joke, ask somebody my age. We don't need another hyper-opulent, outwardly liberal, pseudo-progressive, Harvard-minted Kennedy to pretend to lead us out of the darkness of authoritarian capitalism, racism, militarism, empire, patriarchy, and ecocide. We could, however, use another Dr. King, another great social justice and peace moment, like the one King and his cohorts formed and led beneath and beyond the U.S. election cycle in the 1950s and 60s. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign, Urbana, a local peace group, in the 7th week of 2008 on Mardi Gras. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making. Trump is not the problem. U.S. unjustified killing is. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on the Facebook page for Aware. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scholarly. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mandel, and other members and friends of Aware, saying the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.